Aloha, everyone. So this is the Indic Traditions Part 2. So I wanted to start by just sort of reviewing our introduction to what is religion with Eliade. As you begin to do your post this week, each week as we go through the lectures, always think about what is essential to the system that we're looking at or the religion. What does it mean to be human in this religion? And how do humans interact with the sacred? Um, how does the sacred become community? So these are good things to keep in mind that will help you create good content for your posts. So I did have a comment on my YouTube page. I assume it was from one of you guys. And I really appreciate comments. So you can see I have my microphone closer to me today. Hopefully that'll help with the sound. So I'm kind of, playing around with that. I know everybody has different computers, so I'm still learning about sound in these videos. But I had a question about, or not a question, actually a comment about the 360 million gods, and which are called Deva or Devi. I skipped this slide, but the comment was actually almost exactly this, that the gods are meant to enrich the understanding of Brahman, the ultimate reality or the ultimate one. And so we have to think about, I know that we are in a mostly Christian society, sometimes people see these as idols, and that might be an appropriate depiction of them. But usually, in almost all traditions, these idols are not, people are not worshiping the statue. The statue is a place where the god comes in. So you go to the statue and you use the statue to help you bring the god into the place. And then also, we have these particular depictions of the god, which are local, right? So this is a local version of these different gods, Shiva and Ganesh. And so it helps us to have that local understanding, and then use that to get to that universal or that great reality, the ultimate reality. So keep that in mind. We will talk about this next week in the Abrahamic traditions, because that's really how they began, with Abraham asking his father, who is a idol maker, why are you worshiping a god that you made with your own hands? So, and of course, the father gets very upset because this is his business, right? And that's another thing, that idols are. They're people's wealth. So we see Rachel stealing her father's idols. So this, we're talking about Christianity and Judaism now. There's no condemnation of that in some of the early Bible stories. There's condemnation of the stealing, but she took it because it was worth money. Joseph also has a divination cup. There's no condemnation of that either. When we get to later Christianity, we see one of the main splits between the churches are iconoclasm, which was the Eastern Christians used these idols, these iconoclasts, and it was the same thing. They didn't know how to read. They couldn't read a Bible. And maybe they couldn't even understand a priest, but they could look at these images and they could use the images of the gods to relate and worship and really bring the God in. But it's important that we think about these things in different ways, because it can really change our views of other cultures. this in earlier forms, where we didn't have people who could read, very few people who could read text. This was really this was a really good way for people to relate to the gods through the visual, and I think it's really important now. So today I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the other traditions. Um, so mostly we talked about Hinduism yesterday. And then today I'm gonna start by explaining the differences between Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism um, in the wheel of samsara and how they see um, enlightenment. So it's in some ways it's kind of small, minor, but still differences that help us to understand each of the different sects, and then also understand the whole wheel and the whole idea of samsara even on a broader scale. So in the Hindu tradition, it's really it's the freedom from this ignorance of the true reality. And when it comes to Buddhism, it's really about giving up those attachments. That's what we're going to see today. You're really going to see how attachments are so important in Buddhism and the Buddhist story. And, if you haven't watched that little Buddha story, you might want to do that before you watch this lecture. So in Jainism, it's everything causes karma. So we got to get rid of karma. All karma is attachment. So we kind of got into that yesterday, but in Jainism, it really gets even more focused on karma. There's 148 types of karma. And, so our American version of karma has got to be fit in there somewhere, right? It it has meaning in our society in that form. So it's also interesting you could do a paper on that, the meaning of karma in America and how it may or may not relate to Hinduism. But you want to get rid of good and bad karma because it's all attachments. So again, it's that it's reincarnation, the cycle of birth and rebirth. You keep coming back until you get it right, and there's no eternal end. There's just moksha. So we talked about moksha as the freedom from the cycle, that you become this drop of Atman becomes the drop of water in the Brahman. For the Jains, it's not called moksha, it's called kevala. So it's more of liberated as an individual spirit. So you clean your karma and then you're liberated. So in Buddhism, it's give up your attachments. And it's nothingness or no thing, right? So trying to be no thing. Think about that. How do you do that? How do you become nothing, right? Do you want to become nothing? And what does that mean? What are we really saying? We're saying to give up the attachments. So in the Jain samsara, the world is composed of jiva, soul, and ajiva, matter. So jhana or aloneness is that isolation that is the soul isolated from karma. But gods exist, but they're trapped in the samsara with you. They don't help humans achieve moksha in Jainism. And then in Buddhism, it's called nirvana. So an anatman, no eternal self or soul. So that's how we get to the nothing. Atman and anatman. And the goal is nirvana. So blowing out, it's a blowing out. And it's achieved once desire and thereby suffering are extinguished, and one lives in a state of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue. So it's really important in Buddhism that our desires are what cause those attachments. And so suffering comes from our attachments because we have this desire, right? And it's kind of interesting to really think about that, because it's when you really want something that you suffer when you don't have it, right? But I also think that's very much a part of what it means to be human. And suffering is a really important part of many of the religious traditions, and how the religion is trying to make meaning and sense out of why we suffer and the bigger meaning behind it. But I think in the simplest form, suffering is like the burning. It's like those tapas, it makes you who you are. When you suffer, that's when you're building character and you're figuring out who your real friends are, and all some of the most important things. So yeah, I guess that's the one place I sort of struggle a little bit with Buddhism, because I think as humans we kind of have to appreciate our desire and our suffering, because that's what it means to be human. But I guess, of course, if we want to be enlightened, then we don't want to be human. So it all makes sense. Um, and it all kind of goes in a cycle, right? The way we think about this in our mind. So go ahead and look at Jainism, which means long life. Um, Northern Punjab, that's where it started, from Mahavira. And this is 599 to 527 BCE. It means great hero. And that was the first Jain monk. So Mahavira became enlightened after 12 years and taught for 30 years. He died not eating or breathing. So Mahavira was from the Kshatriya class, which is a royal family in Northeast India. And also, so was the Buddha also in this class. Key to this tradition is ahisma, so nonviolence, but extreme nonviolence. So do not kill any jiva or soul. There's no Vedic sacrifice. They're vegetarian, but they'll sweep the ground, and when they're sweeping, they'll wear a mask because they don't want a bug to go in their mouth, and then they eat the bug. So it's that extreme of nonviolence that you literally wouldn't want to kill a little gnat that went into your mouth while you're sleeping. So the idea is that the worst karma is violent karma. And fasting is encouraged. You eat as little as possible. So the body is sort of a shell. Mahavarats, the great vows. So if you can remember, the Hindu ascetic had his vow, and then he did his tapa, holding that arm up for years and years. So this is one of the main vows is ahisma, or nonviolence. Also truthfulness. So if speaking the truth, though, would lead to violence, then don't say anything. So as you can see, nonviolence is really sort of the foundation for everything. Non-stealing, no illicit sexual content. So stay true to your one woman or man, and non-attachment. So don't let your possessions possess you. And so this idea of relativity. So any issue can be seen from multiple angles. and they're all partially true. Be open-minded, avoid being judgmental, cleanse your own vision, do not waste time criticizing others. So the main sects are I might not be saying these right. Um, Digambara and the Shvetambara. So the Digambara wear nothing. The women have to be reborn as a man to achieve enlightenment. Um, the Shvetambara are the white clad. They wear plain white robe. And women can achieve full liberation. So in that tradition, one of the 24 spiritual leaders was a woman. And here are the other 24 spiritual leaders. So you could do a paper on any of those. We're not going to have time to go into too many of them. The Jains never agreed upon a canon of sacred texts, but they do have 14 texts. As I said, the Buddha, he challenged some of the orthodoxy of the Hindu tradition. So orthodoxy is like the practice of the mainstream. And then typically a new sect, or which can also be called a cult, a sect or a cult, veers away from that mainstream tradition. And then in the case of Buddhism, it eventually becomes a world tradition. So it becomes mainstream of its own. It's the same thing with Christianity, breaks off from Judaism, and pretty much all these religions, they branch off as a sect or a cult and then become a world religion. So we're going to look sort of at, what happened, to the Buddha. Why did he want it to make changes? And like we said, ended with last time, it really, a lot of it had to do with caste, and then later sex, they make changes for women. And that's true in, I think, all the traditions as well. So a lot of my Buddhist slides come from Dr. Helen Baroni, who also works at UH Manoa, an expert in Buddhism. And so the Buddha, the word means awakened one. But his real name was Siddhartha Gautama. And that was the historical Buddha who they think lived from 560 to 480 BCE in northern India. So he has a few other names. The pure illusion, or the Maya, was the breakdown of the ego. And the Bodhi tree is where Buddha achieved enlightenment. So Siddhartha becomes the Buddha. Dharma is the teachings of the Buddha, and Sangha is the Buddhist community. So, here's sort of the scripture, if you want to read through that, of what the Buddha says: I am awake. And then we have to ask, is Buddha a god or an idol? So Buddha never claimed divinity, not that we know of. The last thing Buddha says is work out your own enlightenment or be a light unto the path. And he said, don't pray to the Buddha. Buddha rejected worship of the images of himself. So there were no images at that time. So some people say he never actually said that. Scholars no longer question that he existed. They think he was really a person, but we can't establish much about his life. And so, we can talk about the stories we're reading as myths, but we don't want to think of them as untrue. They may or may not have historical value, but that's not really the point. The point is to convey a instruction, can reflect the way that particular faith um, sees the world, right? So it comes through the story. It could be true, it might not be true. Different people will argue for some of the more fantastical things to be true, and some people will say they're not true. Um, so he does have a miraculous birth story. So it was a virgin birth. Buddha was born right in the forest, and he wasn't actually Buddha until later in life. So the trees lift him up. Little baby Buddha can't wait. He's born conscious, walking and talking. And he says, "This is my last birth." That's the first thing he says when he pops out. "This is my last birth." He has 32 marks of the great man, calf muscles like an antelope, skin so fine no dust can attach to it, has sensitive taste buds, eyelashes like an ox. There was no blood at the birth. The lotus flowers pop up wherever he walked. So you can see how this is the hagiography of the prophet. It's the way the story gets told about um, the leader, the glorified leader of the faith. And he makes a vow. "Maybe I should have taken the middle path," he says. "I won't rise from this tree until I discover truth." So that's his vow. So the middle path. So that's really what Buddha discovered under that Bodhi tree, and everything kind of falls underneath that. So the Four Noble Truths: all life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. To end desire is to end suffering. To end desire, one must follow the Eightfold Path. So what is the Eightfold Path? Right understanding, right intention, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right contemplation. So they also have the 3 refuges, then the 5 aggregates. The 5 precepts are not to take life, not to lie, not to steal, not to engage in sexual misconduct, not to drink alcohol. So very similar to the Jains. The Buddhists have a number of sacred texts. So the Pali Canon, the Chinese Canon, and the Tibetan Canon, translated oral. "Thus have I heard." 18 schools, and they all disappeared except the Theravada, which is the old and main sect of Buddhism. So the Pali the Pali Canon is in the old dialect that Buddha spoke in, and it was palm leaf pages. And there are some problems with the sources. So the canonical texts do not include biography. The earliest biography written was 500 to 600 years after Buddha's death. So how do we know that really is about the Buddha? But this was a highly esteemed leader, spiritual leader, and so I think people take this the biography and the words of these prophets or spiritual leaders very seriously. But who knows, they could have lost a lot. They could have made stuff up to, suit the people of the time. We just don't know. But we do have the three baskets. And, the transition to a world religion really started when they began to form councils to determine what would be orthodoxy in Buddhism, right? They're going to establish the religion. This is what we believe. So the first Buddhist council was in 483, just after Buddha's death. And then 100 years after he dies, they begin to preserve the teachings, and then they establish the three baskets. So in the second Buddhist council, it was already the first schism. This is 400 BC, and Yasa refuses to take money and quotes teachings against monks taking money. So the Council of the Eight Monks, they rule in favor of Yasa. At the third Buddhist council in 250 BCE, we have King Ashoka. To purify the movement, he issued edicts carved into stone. This is, 5 to 8 generations now away from Buddha, but they began to send missionaries, and they have their texts now. They have their, laws and creeds. So, by the time we get to the fourth Buddhist council, the Pali Canon is established, and it's becoming a world religion. It's already going into places like, Greece and Sri Lanka and things, and spreading through Southeast Asia. So the spread of Buddhism, the Buddhist monks go to Sri Lanka in 3 BCE, then to Indonesia, then north to China in the 2nd century on the Silk Road, then from China to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. And then in the 8th century, Tibet, we have the Dalai Lama. So basically, we have two forms of main line traditions of Buddhism from that time. The Theravada, which was that early form of Buddhism, they believe that they follow the original form of Buddhism taught directly by the Buddha. The Arhat, or the Holy One, is the one who attained release to, or nirvana from the cycle, by following the Eightfold Path. Mahayana Buddhism developed 1 BC to 1 CE, so later, and it means the great vehicle. So it refers to various forms of Buddhism that are practiced throughout East Asia, including Zen Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, esoteric and tantric Buddhism, and it represents a later development in the Buddhist tradition, stressing that awakening is available to all through the Bodhisattva. So you can see how, the awakening or the liberation becomes available to all through this figure called the Bodhisattva. What does that do? That allows Buddhism to become more mainstream, right? And so again, this is another sect that breaks off from the main line, but also contributes to Buddhism spreading and becoming a world religion. So some of the innovations are Buddhahood versus nirvana, the ideal practitioner, so the Bodhisattva versus the Arhat, and the awakening and the Four Noble Truths versus the realization of emptiness. So seeing things as they really are, no Maya, no illusion. So what is the Bodhisattva? So the goal is twofold: to become a Buddha or to attain awakening, and to lead others to awakening. But the Bodhisattva may stay in the cycle to help others. And the guiding principle is then compassion. There's Bodhisattva vows. So here's just a few different Bodhisattvas. So there's also changes in the concept of the Buddha. So this is when the Buddha becomes an object of veneration, Buddha. So, which type of Buddha appeals to you? The philosopher, the believer, the meditator? Again, now we have more options. It's going to spread more. It's going to reach more people. So emptiness, the most Mahayana teaching, the most basic teaching, emphasizes that beings and things in the phenomenal world have no substantial unchanging self-nature, an extension of the Theravada concept of no self. So you can see how, it's still connected to that original teaching, but it's, it's changing. It's changing the orthodoxy. So this is a really good example of the process where something starts as a sect that goes against the mainstream or the orthodox tradition and then becomes a world religion. So we'll also look at Sikhism, which is a really interesting form of the Indic traditions. We had the 10 gurus, and they start with Guru Nanak. So his revelation was that he was neither Hindu nor Muslim. He said, "There is neither Hindu nor Muslim, so whose path shall I follow? I shall follow God's path. God is neither Hindu nor Muslim, and the path which I follow is God's." So this actually becomes monotheist. No icons. And it's also later. So now you have the influence of the Abrahamic traditions and monotheism. So now you have an Indic religion or tradition that is monotheist. And it believes that the eternal God is the truth. So God is reached, though, by inner practice, focus on the divine. Rebirth is a move from selfish or self-centeredness, and the goal is to attain union with God. Right? So you see how that changed, but it still maintains aspects of the early Indic traditions. So Guru Arjan built the Golden Temple and compiled the Adigraph, or the scriptures. Gobind Singh came up with the 5 Khalsas, and also he's the final living guru. So what are the 5 Khalsas? So you have to have long hair, the way God made it. You need the comb, or the kangha. So the long hair is the turban. So you'll see the Sikhs, and sometimes people think they're Muslims, but they're not. Let me just go back to this picture. You can kind of see the gear. I think you can see the sword there. So the turban, the comb, it should be neat. Your hair should be neat, not like the ascetics. The bracelet, which symbolizes the never-ending symbol of God, and the sacred underwear, which we'll see in Mormonism, and that symbolizes self-control. and also the kirpan, which is the dagger. So defending the innocent. You have this, you know, dagger to defend, people. And this becomes a problem, right? Like going through an airport. But it's the idea of being ready to defend the innocent at all times. So, Sikhism rejects Hindu and Muslim rituals, rejects the caste system, has equality of race and gender, pacifism and nonviolence, has Jakti instead of Bhakti, has karma and samsara, but they're non-ascetic. And again, the Golden Temple, they're supposed to make a pilgrimage to the temple. There's a lot of politics involved in the Golden Temple. So in 1984, the Indian Army invades. It's called Operation Blue Star. This might be an interesting paper if anybody's interested in Sikhism. But yeah, so that's all for now for the Indic traditions. And just make sure you do those 2 readings, which are actually you're listening and watching, and then just form your post and start thinking now about your final paper, what you might write about in the end. Okay, mahalo, and see you next week.